Right, evening all. Thank you very much for joining this evening's Health and Safety Network. I will be recording this video and it will be uploaded onto my Governance Hub page. There's now a new little YouTube channel that's been set up and we are uploading videos even as we speak. So that should be something that you find helpful, I hope. I know that Stuart needs no introduction. For those of you who are watching this in an asynchronous fashion, Stuart Mills is the Health and Safety Lead for the group. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you all for taking the time to join me on this Thursday evening, or whenever it is that you're taking time out of your life to watch this video at a later date, if that may be the case. If you are watching it after Christmas, I hope you've had a lovely Christmas break, and yeah, that this information is still relevant because things are still moving apace, as we shall see. I'm going to try and use technology to its full capabilities here by already not being able to do what I wanted to do. Bear with me because it's trying to present in that way. I want to try and use the overlay function because I find that if you just have your screen completely taken up by a presentation, it can become a little bit impersonal, shall we say. So let's try this. And then hopefully I should, if I go for this one, appear like a weatherman.
Wow, that's good. You'll have to show me how to do that. Depending
on how my background and outfit and appearance is working, be interesting to see how that's coming out. But let me know if you can see that correctly, and hopefully you should now have the presentation. Oh yes, I can see me. There I am.
Yep. Looking good.
It almost looks like I've had a shave, doesn't it? Yeah, I know we're recording, but I think it's important to address the fact that I'm still rather hirsute at the moment. The intention was that by the time we, or that I would address my appearance at the end of the pandemic, thinking that this would all be over by now, but unfortunately it isn't, and that is where we will start. Leslie has already covered some of the housekeeping matters, but I'll just add, if you've got any questions, the best way to deal with them is to pop them into the chat box and at the side of the screen. Leslie, you okay to keep an eye on those for me if there's anything that comes up? But if there's something that you really do need to raise at any point in the session, do just speak up. There's no harm in that at all. As Leslie mentioned, the session is being recorded, so be nice about me and your peers. But at the same time, if there's a question, there's something that needs to be discussed and or would benefit from discussion, don't be afraid to do so. But inevitably, we need to talk about COVID-19. It is continuing to be an issue for our schools and a challenge, and every indication is the future is going to continue to throw challenges our way as well. So we will cover that. And then what was meant to be the main focus of this session is looking at our annual report. So each year, I produce a report that reviews the previous year's data. That goes through a process of approval to our Finance and Infrastructure Committee, which is my main reporting committee, which is normally in November of each year, covering the preceding academic year, and then to Group Board in December. It was received, commented on and approved at yesterday's Group Board. I do need to get it published onto the Hub. I've not done that yet, but if I don't do it this evening, it will be tomorrow. So you'll be able to see the report in full there. And Leslie, are we able to share a copy with people as well? That might be easier actually, rather than so we'll make sure that the report can get out there. And then a bit of information about sort of what the objectives and plans are for the current year. But to use the old phrase of best laid plans, we know that things might have to be adjusted somewhat, but there are some things that we want to try and do this year at least. And then just some tips for LGB reps for what the sorts of things that would help our schools and the group as well to make sure that we are where we say we are or where we want to be, followed by a Q&A session. But like, as I mentioned earlier, pop your questions in the chat or do speak up if you need to. I can't see you anymore. So Leslie, if any hands do go up, please do make sure these people don't feel that I'm ignoring them and just ploughing on regardless. So a little bit of data first of all. This information on our COVID cases across the group is collated by our education directors. So it's collated in slightly different formats, and it is used in slightly different ways. So from a primary point of view, we have quite summary data from week by week. There are a lot of other sheets and data tables that sit behind on a school by school basis. But I think it's quite interesting to look at this information, our youngest children across the group, and the total weekly cases that have positive confirmed cases that have come to light. And you'll notice some quite obvious patterns and trends that are appearing in there. So the return to school in September, followed by the return after the half-term break, and then a gradual increase as we've come into November. I'm not an epidemiologist, and I don't want to start making any judgments about the significance of the impact of the Omicron variant, because I don't think I'm competent to do that. But the evidence seems to be suggesting that it was already here before it was first identified here, and it's possible, and I do stress that it's possible, that towards the end of November, we may have been seeing those underlying cases coming to light, but we can't say that with any confidence. Interestingly, the figures were dropping off towards the end of last week, and we don't have the data at the moment for this week, but certainly anecdotally from talking to schools this week, and you'll all have more direct experience of how your schools have been directly affected, is that it feels like numbers are increasing, but we know also that attendance is down this week, as I suspect that parents are keeping their children out of school with a view to trying to protect the Christmas break. And so very, very challenging circumstances, but certainly not over just yet. The secondary data is much more basic than that, because they don't keep the weekly totals, but there is the detailed analysis per school. I didn't think it was fair to share individual school data. I don't think that's appropriate for this forum, but generally speaking, though, you can see that there has been a significant number. If you think that we have 10,000 staff across the entire group, of which around about half of that, if just over that, is teaching staff, then there's still a good number of teachers and leaders who have been unable to teach in school due to being a positive case, and also a good number of children, 40 to 50,000 children in the group. So we're talking sort of 10%-ish maybe that have been affected so far this year. So clearly something that is still causing us some concern and some challenge. So as we say in this slide, we felt, or we hoped, that come September, and the tone from the government, the approach that was being taken, the guidance that was coming out from DfE, was all very much geared towards referring to as being in the recovery phase. If you look at a business continuity model, we were in the active phase, or the reaction phase, and we were moving into the recovery phase, so getting back to business as usual and returning to life as normal. That is clearly not the case, but we're in this bizarre situation now where we're still doing more than we were doing last year, but with controls still in place. So we're in recovery and reaction at the same time. I think that that's just a product of where we are, but the point that I think is really important there is it illustrates the additional strain that it's placing on our school staff and our schools, because we're trying to be everything to everyone, and it's very, very difficult to do. If we go back to sort of April, May 2020, when bubbles first came into existence, it was confusing, but there was a clear direction of what was meant to be happening, whereas now it's much more challenging for schools. And I try to be very sympathetic to that when we have conversations with school leaders. That links to the second point, and I'm sure you feel the same, and your colleagues are feeding back to you in the same way, is that everyone is just very, very tired now. And so we're trying to make sure that we aren't placing any additional burdens on schools, but we have, purely from a health and safety point of view, operated a very coronavirus focused approach for the last 22 months, as it is really now, and we need to be mindful that all of the other health and safety duties didn't go away. All of the other functions that are carried out that can link to health and safety outcomes didn't go away, and we need to make sure that we don't completely take our eye off the ball on those, both in school and at the centre. What we do know for January at the moment, and this is interesting when I was putting these slides together at the beginning of this week, is every day it seemed to progress that little bit further. So I've tried to keep this as current as I possibly can, and I think they're still accurate at this moment in time, unless I've missed something this afternoon. Is that we know that in January we're returning to asymptomatic testing in our secondaries. That's something that we're now comfortable in doing. We know how it operates. We know what's necessary. The burden is on getting the consent for those people that weren't in the process before, or making sure that we still have those for people as necessary, and making the plans so that we know there's some flexibility in the start of the year to be able to get that testing carried out. But we know that January is going to be very, very busy. Further controls are a possibility, depending which news sources you refer to. There are different interpretations of where we are ending up, on what January will hold, everything from the doom and gloom to the more optimistic outlooks. The best advice I can give at this time is plan for the worst and hope for the best. Keep your contingency plans under review. Make sure that your school is in a position where if it needs to switch to remote learning at short notice, it's capable doing so, and that your ability to step up controls, maybe returning to face covering wearing in classrooms. I know some schools have chosen already to do that based on local case numbers or following direction from directors of public health, or to look to introducing groups or bubbles. Everything's on the table. There's nothing there that's stuff that we haven't done before. It's just being in a position where we're able to roll that out at pace if we need to. And as I say, plan for the worst, but hope for the best. They also need to keep the COVID-19 risk assessments under review. That shouldn't be a surprise. That's something that should have been happening throughout this process, and the regular monitoring as well in schools of are we doing what we say we're doing on our risk assessments? Are our controls effective? There is an element of fatigue, and there's a better word than complacency, because it's not malicious. It's just we're slipping into this is just how it is now, and the standards can drop a little bit. So it's keeping an eye on that and making sure that people are still doing what we say we're doing, whether it's in relation to hand hygiene or if there is a face covering policy that is in place. And then just to comment on air purification units and the DfE's guidance. So that was a point where at the start of the week was, we know that there's some work going on here and we'll wait for further information. And no sooner as I committed that to writing, DfE sent out a guidance note saying, oh, by the way, there's now a framework for air purification devices and some guidance on how to use them. It's an interesting situation. And I think that the DfE guidance has got the tone right here, in that it explains that air purification units are not a substitution for improving ventilation. So if there's an area where ventilation levels are of a concern, and there's the data perhaps from the CO2 monitors to back that up, then the air purification units can be used as I've said here, a plaster for location specific application, but they can't be a permanent solution. And part of me thinks the DfE are fully aware of that, because if you've seen the framework, there are two devices on there, and one of them is a domestic Dyson unit, which is not going to last a continued application in a school setting. I was going to make a comment about Dyson equipment there, but as this is recorded, I won't, just in case. So keeping an eye on those things, and we will continue to review the guidance documents as well, and share information with schools as and when it comes to light. There's no indication at this time of anything new coming into play, anything that we haven't done before. Yes, we might have to step up controls again, but there's so far I've not seen anything that is novel in how we will be required to operate.
Stuart, there's a question on the data. Sure. Casimir asks, he says, I understand that individual instances of COVID, children or staff, are not recorded in health and safety or other record logs. Apparently COVID instances have to exceed the minimum criterion to get recorded, or has he misunderstood statements made to him?
That might be the data that the local authorities are collecting. So our education teams are keeping a log of every case that comes through, not the personal details, but the case information and the year groups that are affected. So that we know as a group what the educational impact is on our schools, and where the detriment might be there, and where issues might arise. Different local authorities are asking for different information in different ways from schools. And the DfE's contingency framework outlines thresholds at which schools may need to step up their control measures. And from recollection, that's 5 cases where people are believed to have been in a group that is mixed, or 10% of those as a total. Some local authorities have used that threshold, others have applied their own. It does vary. So can you just say the question again, Leslie?
So it's about individual instances of COVID, children or staff not recorded on health and safety or other record logs. Apparently COVID instances have to exceed a minimum criterion to get recorded, or has he misunderstood?
So the actual recording in schools, to my understanding, it's only in relation to attendance. The schools aren't required and have been told that they should not be carrying out any contact tracing anymore. That is all being done by test and trace. So the only information that the school would be required to hold in relation to COVID cases would be, as I say, in relation to attendance, or to link it to the health and safety element of that question, would be if it was to be linked to potential exposure as a result of a work activity in line with the guidance that we published last year. So that would be then under the RIDDLE regulations, the reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrence regulations. And we published a guidance note last year which remains valid on how to determine if a case is reportable by the employer as a RIDDLE infection, because the vast majority won't be, because you have to be able to show that there is reasonable evidence that it was likely that the infection was caused through work, and more likely than in community acquired infection, for example. And that's a very difficult test to satisfy unless you have got the example that I'd have, where we know we've had situations in schools where we have staff who have shared a communal office, and one member of staff, so patient 0, if we can call them that, has tested positive, and then over the next couple of days other people in that office are also testing positive, and the only thing that links them all is their time together in that office. But it's HSE have made some comment on this and what their feelings are around it, and they do have an important role to play in making sure that organisations are applying the right standards. But it's still there's a bit of a moot point as to whether or not it would be covered under health and safety legislation, and I've seen arguments on both sides of that. But for example, the COSH regulations, which are normally concerned with agents that are hazardous to health, clearly excludes respiratory infections that are caused from a community acquired from the community. But it doesn't remove the overarching duties under the Act, Section 2 and Section 3 duties. But let's not get into a legal session at this stage. If anyone wants to talk through that more, please let me know. Can't imagine there'll be many takers, but you never know. But it's so to go back to the question, Casimir, is that the data that's being requested does vary by local authority. Some are asking for a lot, some are asking for a lot less. The schools absolutely need to be keeping a record in relation to attendance in students, and in relation to staff, then it will be sickness absence data with consideration of RIDDLE reporting where that applies. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any others?
No.
Okay. So yeah, we'll as I say, we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll see what the new year brings. Who knows at the moment? But then moving on to the annual report, as I mentioned, it's something that we produce at the end of each academic year, reviewing it's a year in review, hence annual report, sorry. And some of the key updates in relation to the group in the last year is we had 3 schools join us, and unfortunately 2 schools left. Well, one was divested and another closed. So we're relatively stable this year in relation to numbers. But obviously we were in a pandemic, and it's possible that growth may be back on the agenda, listening to some of the conversations coming out of central government over the past couple of months. And then the data that's in the table that you see below captures those key sort of items in relation to group health and safety. So the number of schools that we have, the return of local managements and arrangements is the group health and safety management policy. So that's the document that outlines the roles and responsibilities of trustees down to frontline employees, that is completed by the school to show who does what in each school, and then signed off by the head and the LGB, with a copy returned to me, ideally in T1 each year. And the reason why T1 is it should be being completed for the start of the academic year and being communicated to staff, because that's when most new starters come in a school setting. As you'll see over the years, the return rate on that has been not the best, but it is improving. So 55% last year, it's 59% this year. Prior to that, it was lower, and we have seen a trend of it gradually increasing. I'm pleased to know, and I'm grateful to colleagues on the call, because no doubt you've been involved in making this happen as well, is that we're currently running this year at 90% of return rate for that document. So thank you very much to those of you who've managed to keep the schools focused on that. It's quite impressive, considering everything else that's going on. So thank you for your efforts there. School visits are an interesting one. They dropped off a cliff. Lockdowns don't help. In fact, the only visit there was to a school in the Cambridge area, as they were the first victims, not the right word, but the first school selected for a HSE spot check. And so we use that as a learning opportunity to get some information as to what HSE were looking for, and to be able to share that information then more widely across the group. We do want to try and get back to doing visits at some point, but we're also thinking about what's the most effective way of operating and getting schools to where they need to be. Is it me travelling into one school out of 86 and spending a couple of days there and doing visits, or is it initiatives that apply more broadly across the group using cluster staff, EBMs, executive business managers where they exist, cluster estates managers, governors, to be able to put the pressure on schools to maintain their efforts wherever they need to, because we do need to make sure, some of you may be familiar with the Swiss cheese model, but we need to ensure competence at all levels, not a reliance on somebody from central office saying what needs to be done in all circumstances. So I come to that in the end, in one of the takeaways is have that conversation with your schools and make sure that you know that there are people in each of the roles, particularly in the higher risk departments, who are competent to do that role, because they need to be able to explain the sufficiency of their arrangements should something go wrong. The trust will still hold the accountability, but we do look for those individuals to be competent. As an anecdotal example, when before the pandemic, when I was auditing, I would frequently go into, for example, a science department in a secondary school and ask to talk to the head of department about their arrangements and their policies and the things that were in place. And what would transpire is that they became a head of department sometime in the last academic year because of a change in personnel. They were an existing member of teaching staff who was then promoted, but they hadn't been provided with any training or support of what it meant to be a head of department. And it's very hard to criticize somebody for not doing what they should have been doing if nobody's ever told them what it is that they should be doing in the first place. So making sure that we've got the right people, really competent people in each of those roles is absolutely fundamental to how we operate.
Stuart?
Yes.
Phil asked a question. It can't just be you, Stuart, or is that a question or a comment? It can't just be you, Stuart, or we will fall in the trap of who is responsible for health and safety, the health and safety manager. That's what Phil says. Michael Coulter has asked some questions around RIDOR reportable. Is RIDOR does it include COVID, and can it be broken into different incidents?
So yes, as I mentioned a moment ago, RIDOR does include COVID, but only in specific circumstances. I can share a guidance document afterwards if you'd like to read through that explains it in detail, and there's a flow chart that helps schools determine whether or not it would be RIDOR reportable. But the two tests, as I mentioned, are that there is reasonable evidence that it was likely that the infection was caused as a result of exposure at work. The example I give, my in a previous life, I worked in microbiology. I actually did virology at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, so I know far too little about what's going on here, but I do have a little bit of knowledge of the sorts of processes that are in place. And if you are working with an infectious agent, and for example in an analytical lab, and I drop a vial of this and I then breathe it in, that is a work-related exposure. There is something to do with my work activity that has resulted in me getting ill. It's much more challenging in relation to COVID to say that such a person X acquired this infection whilst at work, as opposed to, so they spend 40 hours at work, for example, but the rest of the time they're out in the community. And particularly in the current climate, back when we were in lockdown, it was quite straightforward. You were at home or you were at work, and that was it. Maybe shopping, grocery shopping. Whereas now, I was at a gig not so long ago, sat in a room with 5,000 other people. I can be down the local restaurant down the end of the road having a meal, my Christmas meal, for example. So it's much more challenging now to say that this is acquired at work as opposed to in the community. It doesn't mean that we can't, and it means that every situation should still be considered. And an important point for RIDDOR in general, I think is a really important point to note is RIDDOR is a notification process. Once something hits a threshold, it needs to be notified to the regulator. It is just a notification point. All it is we're telling you that something has happened. There are incidents that occur that are below the RIDDOR reporting threshold that still warrant review and investigation, proportionate to the level of harm or the incident that's occurred. But we're looking at the prevention of occurrence of either the same thing again or potentially something worse. So just because something is or isn't RIDDOR isn't necessarily a barometer for whether it's serious or not, or whether it's something that warrants further investigation or not. Every incident, and it applies to COVID as well, to take it back to the question, every incident warrants consideration. Most will require nothing more than just somebody to look at it and say, you know what, there's nothing further that needs to be done here. But having that moment to check is absolutely critical. And Phil, thank you for your comments there. Yeah, I agree. You know, that's exactly it. I'll support and advise wherever I can, but it brings us back to making sure that we've got people in schools that absolutely know their stuff. That's absolutely critical. Any more? No. Service requests, I could just keep a track of questions and queries that come in. I've done it for a couple of years now, just to get an idea. I've looked at a system in the past to try and categorize it. Some of you may have used our IT service desk system, and the way that operates now allows them to categorize queries as they come in, so you can work out what the areas are. I haven't launched that yet because I really value the personal. One of the advantages of being a sole trader, if you like, is that I really value the personal relationship I have with school health and safety leads and other members of staff within schools as well. And I worry that putting myself behind a system might remove the honesty that I get from some schools and the willingness to just tell me what they think in an email if they don't know that it's definitely me that's at the end of it that's going to be reading it. So I'm on the fence of that. There's also the time investment of getting that system up and running, but I can see a real logic in getting it done because it will allow me to do better categorization of events, work out what the common themes are that are coming out, produce additional guidance. Yeah, absolutely, there's something that could be done there. And I've started to record just for the last couple of years, obviously, the COVID queries that have come in as well, because that has been a significant demand on my time. And it's really interesting to see the sorts of conversations that have gone on, because 12 months ago the conversations were, what on earth do we do? Whereas now the conversations are more, this is what we think we need to do. These are the arrangements that we have in place. We think we're in a good place. What do you reckon? So we've moved from a position of complete absence of knowledge to schools having a really good handle on what it is that needs to be done, and just looking for that level of reassurance that things are okay. We do still get riddles about, Sarah had COVID 2 days ago and John had it 5 days ago. They were in a class with 14 people and these were 1 meter, these were 2 meter, who needs to be, and they're not going to go away. And I had a joke with one of the RDs the other day that I could see that sort of scenario becoming a question on a GCSE paper at some point in the future, because every one of them tests your brain again and again, even though you think you've been through it all so many times and you know the rules inside out. Every one I go back and I check and I make sure I'm still giving accurate advice, because little changes have occurred over the years. That's terrible, isn't it? Over the months. But most recently in relation to Omicron, so the requirement to isolate and now to daily test. So things do change, and those queries will continue to come in, I'm sure. The Health and Safety Committee meeting minutes return. So the requirement for every school to have a Health and Safety Committee that meets at least once per term in a 3-term year, covered in our Health and Safety Committee policy. Which details who needs to attend, the standing agenda items. You can add as many additional things as you want, and as I say, who needs to be in attendance, which should be everybody who's on this call. If it's just LGB representatives here, might be others sneaking in. I think there were 1 or 2 that said they might. I asked for those minutes. This is one of our monitoring mechanisms. So the employer's duty to check that we're doing what we say we're doing is that the minutes are then sent back to me. I can then review them, add any comments if necessary, and upload them to the hub so that they're there if anybody needs to see them at some point in the future. Return rates for these have been low throughout the years. If we see over last year, we were at 44%, but the previous year we were at 21%. So we are increasing, but we're not at the level that we should be at. It's a really important.
Interrupt,
yeah,
Phil.
Please.
So, can I?
Phil.
Interrupt, Stuart. Sorry.
Poor Phil.
Asking you a question. Right. So a couple of things really. The point to make is that the Health and Safety Committee is a school committee, not a governing body committee. For those who are watching this afterwards, it's a school-based committee, not a governors committee. However, what you will see on the standard agenda is health and safety as a standard item. And if you're very canny and time your health and safety committee to coincide appropriately with your governors meeting, it can absolutely usefully be reported and commented upon before it goes to Stuart. And that is something that I've done as a result of feedback from governors. And those of you who are chairs on the call, you might want to check that with your health and safety people. Those of you who are watching this afterwards, just check to see when your last set of minutes were presented, because there should be 3 sets of those minutes presented over the course of the academic year, and Stuart should have them all. So I'm intending to meet with Stuart. He doesn't know this yet, but hey, here you are, Stuart, in January to find out who's missing, so that I can go back to those agenda and chase those up at school level. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. That's a really good point there, is that it is a schools committee. And I've had a couple of questions of that on that recently from 1 or 2 schools that are saying, we're sorry, we haven't got this committee up and running yet because the LGB haven't determined where this, how this committee will be structured. And that's possibly my fault in the policy. It's not clear enough in there, and I will revisit that. And I think it's the point that Leslie just made is really valuable, that we'll look at it again and make sure that everyone is aware of what's going on. But the purpose of it is well, threefold. It's the monitoring check I mentioned earlier on to the centre, so that we can make sure that things are being looked at and that there are appropriate actions being taken. It provides the mechanism for communication to the full LGB of any matters of note. They don't need to be bogged down with the detail of when the last time that the 3G pitch was brushed, for example, but they need to be made aware of any matters of significance that might need to go onto, for example, the strategic risk register. And then thirdly, the chair should be the person chairing that committee. The head. I did say that, didn't I? The head should be the person chairing that committee, because this is our most reliable way of being able to formally evidence the head's involvement in health and safety. They are the general manager of the school. They are responsible for all areas of school operation, and quite often there's that gap in that golden thread of management that shows where is the evidence that they are sitting at the top of this tree and they are aware of what is happening in their school. And this is a good way to achieve that. E-audit returns are it's an e-audit, it's an electronic audit. So it's rather than an in-school one-to-one audit, an e-audit looks across compliance across for a single topic across the whole group. So for example, at the moment, the e-audit that's live is looking at work at height, and every school gets a form. It's a self-assessment process held through Microsoft Forms. that we ask the schools to respond to the question. A negative response indicates an area of action, and it's normally, no, it is clear from the question what the action is that's required if you give a negative response. But then the schools are also required to say, well, what are you going to do about it, and make it a smart objective so that we know that it's either good, bad, and if it's bad, what's happening about it. Return rates have been very high for those recently. I've noticed, I think this term is dropping off. So that one is still open, e-audit, but the reference, they get a short code, which is the start of the academic year. So in this case, 21 oblique, and then the number of the e-audit. So we're in 21.1 at the moment, looking at work at height. We're just at about 60% return rate, so it is low. And I try to get those back before the Christmas break, and that's my treat over the Christmas period, is to review that information. So do please have a conversation in your schools and make sure that they have completed that and got that information back. We had a very serious accident in relation to work at height last year, where a caretaker fell from a step ladder and broke his back. That has not warranted investigation by HSE, I do not know. If you look at their news feed, if you look at their prosecution history, it's full of cases exactly like that. So we definitely use the opportunity to look at lessons learned there, work very closely with the school on that investigation. Due to lockdown, they actually had to lead the investigation, but with my remote support, whereas due to the severity of it, it's normally one that I would get involved in. And we published some information at the end of last year around work at height, and also the Ladder Association updated their code of practice. It's easy stuff. It's just also equally easy to get wrong, and I think that's the problem, is that it's easy to just common practice to sleep in to creep in there, sorry, to what's actually happening. So do have a look in your school and see if you've returned that work at height audit or the e-audit for this term, please. That would be really helpful. RIDDOR incidence is just a number. I say just a number. I'll come on to that in more detail in a moment. And high-level audits, I don't think there's much to say about that. That was interrupted. Briefing notes are regular communications that are sent out. I don't track the COVID briefing notes, the COVID emails that I send out. These are the briefing notes, are published documents that go out communicating information. And then last year was really poor timing for our health and safety topic policies, which have a 3-year review cycle. And little did I know 3 years ago that their review period was due to come up in the middle of a pandemic. But yes, that is one thing we had to work through. Is there were 32 policies that were then reviewed and updated and ensured that they were still relevant for operation. The good news is that the changes were relatively minimal, but there were, because they had an opportunity to be out and being used and being live, we'd had feedback from schools on what was good, what was bad, what was clear, what was perhaps a little bit ambiguous and required further explanation, and 1 or 2 errors as well. I can't claim to be perfect. Tried to get it all right the first time, but yeah, that's the opportunity there to put those things right, and that's. Can I
interrupt you?
You can.
Do you mind? So in terms of policy, there's a lot of policies there that have been reviewed within the umbrella of the health and safety policy that you've all adopted as a local governing body. You're not required to scrutinise every single one. But what I would say is, if you are sitting on the call and you're the health and safety governor, it's really important that you ask your health and safety person in school to make sure you get copies of those updated policies, so that you know what the policies are required. And you can sign up for that on the portal quite easily.
You can, and each of the topic policies should be being signed off by the LGB rep for health and safety as well. Yeah. You aren't accountable for it, but the idea behind that, and also by the head, is it's bringing more people's attention to it. And every policy ends with a summary of requirements. So the policy contains the detail of what it is we're trying to do and how we need to get there. And then there's a section of summary of requirements that is a bullet list capturing the key points from within the policy. So it condenses the information that is there. The advice I give to LGB reps for health and safety is use that bullet list as your aide-memoire to run through with your school. Have we got all of this stuff? You're not expected to be experts in these fields, but the school should be able to readily provide the information that evidences compliance with each of those points. That's the outcome that we're aiming for there. Thank you, Leslie. That's a really important point to make. Moving on to accidents and incidents, we won't go into too much detail here, but I think the figures are quite interesting to see. Is gradually over the years, numbers of accidents are increasing. That's no great surprise. The group is growing. The number of people that it covers are growing, and we'll come on to the statistics of it in a moment. But we can see that we do get a considerable number of accidents. That the totals that you see on that figure are for staff, students, and visitors, other non-employees as well. Incidents are supposed to be near misses. We called them incidents because of the connotations around near misses and what that actually means to people. However, what's been borne out in that category as it's written, even though it explains that it's an incident where no harm is realized, but it has potential for harm to occur, and therefore there's a learning opportunity that could be derived from that. We're getting things recorded in there that aren't near misses, so behavior incidents, fights, medical incidents. So we've changed that language now on arms and in the accident policy, that it now refers to near misses. We've gone back to the old term. If it's not broke, why fix it? We tried to solve a problem that clearly didn't exist. Bumps and scrapes are the very low level incidents that typically occur in primary and early years, where there is no obvious injury or need for first aid, but there's a cold compress provided or a bit of TLC, and which schools historically used to write down in a book in the classroom. They still can use that system. There's no requirement to record bumps and scrapes using arms. It's there if schools want to use it, and it helps remove any data protection issues over bits of paper floating around in the school. But it also then allows for trend analysis quite easily as well, because depending, the way that arms works is it follows the typical data mantra of garbage in, garbage out, but making sure that if you get really good data going in, you can then do really strong analysis on it at the other end. So if you're recording in your bumps and scrapes information where the incident occurred, for example, then it's very easy to run a report and see, okay, we know that Butterfly Playground has had a higher number of accidents this year. No serious harm, because otherwise it would be recorded as a full accident, but maybe there's something worth looking at. And it's just looking at those intelligence opportunities again. And it links back to what I said earlier on about accident data and things being RIDDOR and things not being RIDDOR. You don't have to wait for something to trigger that threshold before you look at it. It might be that there's nothing useful that gets derived from looking at it, but it doesn't mean that you can't or you shouldn't. Dangerous occurrences and occupational diseases are two specific RIDDOR categories that are normally very rarely used because they don't really occur very often in the education sector. The two dangerous occurrences you see there relate to fires, so electrical fires resulting in plant stoppage for more than 24 hours or more. I'm not going to say it. I was going to make a comment on the frequency of fires across the group. I'll leave you to piece together what that is, but that's good. And occupational diseases, that's a new introduction because of the requirements around reporting for COVID infection. So there were 7 over the course of last year. If I remember correctly, we currently have 4 this year that have been reported. And so that's then captured here, but HSE have not investigated, certainly across United Learning, any incidents of COVID infection acquired whilst at work, and I don't believe they've investigated any in society either, because there's a dangerous precedent that would be set. They're doing spot checks, they're making sure that people have got the basics in place, but it's very difficult to prove causation here. So I think they're very careful around that. And then there's just a summary of the data around our specified injury rate. So that's things covered under the RIDDOR regulations around things like fractures, amputations, loss of consciousness. We don't get a lot of those. It tends to be fractures that occur. So it's people falling over. Trampolining. I would never have believed before I came into the education sector that trampolining was going to be the most hazardous thing that we dealt with. But when you think about it, it's falling from height repeatedly. So I guess it makes sense. But yeah, quite nasty injuries. And you look at everyone who has a trampoline in their back garden in the neighbourhood, and you think, now I'd be getting rid of that if I were you. But then you think, am I just turning into your typical health and safety manager there? You're like, don't like risk, everything's dangerous. But our specified injury rate, as you can see there, is high. We're above the national rate. That data is taken from HSE statistics for the education sector. I've scaled this up to per 1,000 employees, by the way, because it's normally a figure of, or down, I should say, as a figure of per 100,000, just to make it relatable to our operation. But when you drill down into that data, and you'll see in the annual report, there are full details against every single incident, where the school they happened and what it is that had occurred. Is, if I remember correctly, 5 of the 8 specified RIDDOR injuries that occurred in the last year were slips and trips. And so it's very much down to things like housekeeping, and very timely at this point of the year is adverse weather procedures. We had, I think, if I remember, 2, maybe 3 of the incidents last year were due to snow and ice. And people then suffering fractures as a result of falling, staff suffering fractures as a result of falling, as a result of adverse or falling temperatures. But our 7-day absence rate, which is one that quite often captures people's attention, because it's the, oh, I've got a bit of a twinge, I can't come to work, and people link it with people pulling a sickie. Doesn't bear out in our case. We're well below the national rate there. So a 7-day absence under RIDDOR is the inability to do your normal role. You don't have to not be at work, but you can't do your normal role as you would ordinarily do. But we're well below the national rate there. So there's some really good work in and I think it's probably also borne out by people's commitment to schools, because they love their jobs, they love working where they work, and I'm not saying they come to work ill, but they're less inclined to do the well, you know, my team are playing in the European Championships this week, I'll make sure I've got time off so that I can go and see them play, which is sometimes
cynic. Stuart, there's a bit of a debate going on the chat here around numbers. So Michael's making the point very high numbers work to be done, but Phil's also making the point that, you know, is it around reporting? Are we really increasing, or are we improving reporting? And Phil is saying, how can you get more accidents when schools are, you know, not as open as they have been, semi-closed during COVID? I think many head teachers would disagree that schools are closed. Schools haven't been closed. Actually, they've been open, but I get the point that you're making. Any comment on those?
So the high numbers part, I think if we ignore the bumps and scrapes, I missed an element of bumps and scrapes as well. Sorry, we changed the policy, the accident incident management policy, to allow very low level incidents involving students, particularly in secondary, to be recorded as bumps and scrapes, where it is abundantly clear that the accident did not arise out of a failing of premises equipment or supervision. An example being a friction burn on the 3G pitch. Somebody needs to look at it and make a judgment that, you know what, the pitch is in good condition, there's nothing wrong with how this is being managed, but we still want to make a record of this because there is harm has been realized, even though the treatment isn't necessarily as serious as it perhaps might not warrant serious treatment. So we allowed schools to make that record under bumps and scrapes. What can't go in there is anything affecting a member of staff. That must go down as an accident, or anything affecting another non-employee. It's just that very small group of people, because we realise we're getting a lot of not sporting injuries, but sporting, I'm trying to think of a word, grazes is probably the best I can come up with, things that aren't necessarily and don't warrant a 4-page report being written every time something happens. We want to capture the data, but we want to capture it proportionately. But if we can then draw a line through bumps and scrapes and say that unfortunately they are because small children do have a habit of bumping into things. I think that's a fair assessment there. But I would stress what I said earlier on as well, though, is that just because it's not the higher level or doesn't trigger a RIDDOR doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at it. And so absolutely, if you're looking at your school's data, and every school can drill down into ARMS and see their data as well. So forgive me, there's so many topics we could talk about and so much detail I could go into, but if there is anything we want to look at in more detail, do tell me. But the way that ARMS works is that every employee in each school can create records, but only a limited number of people in each school can view their school's data, and what we call super users. Those permissions are automatically applied to the head and the health and safety coordinator and deputy coordinator. That's carried out through our HR system. There are just too many people to manually manage that on request. However, if there are people who would like access, you need to have a school domain, I think. Then and they want to be able to see the data, then drop me an email, explain who they are and why they need access. That satisfies our GDPR element, and I can get that arranged. But then those individuals can access the report builder side of ARMS and see everything that's happened in their school in relation to accident data. They can then break it down by the different accident type, depending, as I mentioned earlier, about the garbage in, garbage out comment. Those that they can then filter based on location or area or classroom or activity, and find a way to analyze that data at a local level and work out what are the patterns and trends. Are there patterns and trends? Because quite often it's quite random what occurs in schools, or the solution is something as draconian as playtime is standing still rather than running around. I think I remember at the start of the pandemic, there was people being put into boxes in playgrounds in primary, wasn't it, and stand there and nobody moved, but you've got your outside time. That's not obviously what we want to aim for, but certainly look at that at a local level, drill down into that information. What else was there, Leslie? Sorry.
I think you've covered it really. We've just been looking at high numbers. I mean, don't forget, when you look at those numbers increasing, we've got more schools.
Yeah.
We've got a lot more schools since 2018. I don't know where I've lived the last 100 years. So yeah,
that's very true. And then there's more detail here. This is all in the report, as I say, if you want to look at this in under more scrutiny. But this is breaking down that accident data more so. So if you see, we've got 61,000 students actually were on roll at the end of last year, and 9,000 staff. And we've broken it down to give those rates that allow us then to track over time. I'll let you look at that at your leisure. Looking at average working day sickness, this is long-term sickness, which is a period of 4 weeks or more. This is actually overseen and managed by our HR department and our HR business partners who actively work with schools on managing long-term sickness and getting this down. So by the time somebody's gone on long-term sick, the health and safety part's kind of, the traditional health and safety part is over. Whatever it was that caused that has happened. We're now dealing with the rehabilitation and bringing them back to work. That I include this data in the report because there is a link, there is a crossover, and you can see that for both our independents and academies, we're round about the national average, and that's taken from ONS labour force data, that national average. So we're round about that. Independents are actually slightly better, academies are just slightly worse, but not significantly so. And you can draw your own conclusions as to why that might be. The breakdown of classification of absence, I think, is informative, particularly because the first two areas, we'll come on to stress separately in a moment, but the first two of your back and spinal problems and other musculoskeletal are your traditional health and safety long-term sickness absence issues. It's the moving and shunting stuff has resulted in a back injury, which means I'm unable to carry out my duties for an extended period of time. Those figures are broadly stable. And interestingly that we've seen them, and I think this ties in as well with the accident point that you mentioned earlier, Leslie, about in a quieter year, should that figure not have gone down, is if you look at the spread of long-term sickness absence, that's also broadly remained the same. So although I think school operation was undoubtedly affected by the pandemic, we were still operating schools, people were still at work. And to take the facilities teams as an example, they did a lot of moving and shunting stuff over the last years, whether it was clearing soft furnishings out of rooms, whether it was bringing inordinate amounts of hand sanitizer in. There was a lot of work that was going on there that would still give opportunity for these sorts of injuries to occur. These really come down to making sure that things like manual handling risk assessments and training and support are carried out effectively. Particularly, I see, and I'm sure everybody's seen it everywhere that they worked, bad practice in relation to manual handling whenever they go into school. It doesn't have to be school. You can go to Morrison's and you see it all the time. I, as a health and safety professional and as somebody who stacks shelves in Sainsbury's, I know full well that my manual handling practices were abysmal. Yes, you've done the training, but it very quickly reverts to however way allows you to get the job done. But it's trying to keep an eye on it, trying to make sure that people are reminded what good technique is. But there is also, to play the other side of it as well, I think there's an element of people who perhaps are not happy at work and maybe not entirely honest in their affliction, but I think that's a very small proportion. I don't have any data to back that up, but I'd just like to think that the best in people on that. And stress, depression and anxiety is a really challenging one, particularly over the past year. But while cases have gone up, the spread has dropped slightly, but I think it's still important to note that it is there, and it's not surprising given the year that we've had that people are feeling very much at the end of their tether. And I think that's not just related to the pandemic as well. There's all sorts of things that have fed around that, but the pandemic has just been something else on top. And I'm sure you've all seen or had seen the big rocks that John had identified during the pandemic of what we need to do. The third one of which was we've got your backs. And whilst I can't magically appear in Carlisle to help with moving equipment or planning activities, I'm at the end of the phone, I'm on an email, and let's talk through the arrangements and try to provide that reassurance to schools so that they are feeling that they're in the right place. But the stress, depression and anxiety one, there is a policy on that. There's the group work-related stress policy. There's further guidance in HR. There's a lot of work going on in initiatives in HR around well-being that Kylie Laws has been leading on, which has got loads of additional resources now to try and help with the dealing with the effects of and the longer term care. But do make sure that your schools are starting from the stress assessment point of view. Don't just wait for it to happen. What can be done at the outset? And there's an entire, we could talk for days just about stress management in itself. But the tendency is to look at the remedial actions and things that can be done to help people once they are suffering, whereas our duty is to try and manage that risk in the outset and prevent it from reaching that stage. And the flippant response you get is, well, we can't just magic resource out of thin air and make sure that there's more staff to reduce the workload. That's just a fact. That just can't happen. We've got to work with what we've got. But the HSE have a guidance document called the management standards, which is referred to in the work-related stress policy, which is absolutely brilliant at structuring those thoughts and those conversations, and quite often just having that conversation and that planning and thinking, okay, well, let's look at our situation in the round. Is a good, it can have benefits. So I would recommend having a look at that if you have time and you think it might be of relevance in your school. And then just finally on the service requests side of things, there's the figures there you can see over the years since we've been counting. They're gradually creeping up. That's fine. That's what I'm here for. Some of them are quite short, others are very meaty and take a long time to get through, but that's just how it is. Hopefully the COVID numbers will continue, or the COVID queries will continue to drop, so that we can start getting back to some more business as usual. But while the queries come in, we'll deal with them and we'll support them. I mentioned about the policies and audits and the e-audits as well. So the 3 audits that we did, with the first one, we looked at the COVID-19 risk assessment. So we've been through a number of processes of schools devising risk assessments, following a template, following the DfE guidance, condensing information, calling them all in and reviewing all of them. That was a challenge. We did that 3 times. And then after the summer, once we got to September of last year, we did a remote review. So we had a graduate working in central office who carried out a review of all risk assessments, because they were supposed to be published on school websites, to make sure they had been done. And that was the first e-audit of the year. We did a play equipment review following an accident that occurred at a primary in London, where we made some changes to the work equipment policy to make sure that the right level of inspection was being carried out for play equipment. That was quite an interesting gap that was identified there, and HSE did investigate that one, which is quite strange because the playground accident occurred at the same sort of time as the ladder accident, but they investigated one and not the other. We ended with a fee for intervention notice there, so they effectively serve notice on the school and say, we've identified a material breach. It's not significant enough to serve notice or go to court, but you need to pay us thus much monies for our time rendered. And so we updated the work equipment policy, carried out this review, as I say, this group-wide review, and made some changes to expectations around play equipment. That's load-bearing play equipment, so trim trails and things like that, not ride-on scooters and the stuff. One of the things that was really positive out of the pandemic is we launched health and safety drop-in sessions for schools. So it started off in the March and April of 2020. when we really were thinking, what on earth is going on here? Are we going to have to mothball buildings? Are we going to have to shut schools? If we do that, what does that mean for building security and maintenance, PPM? What about when we want to open again? They ran until the summer, and attendance dropped off to the point where it was just me in a room. So they kind of ended there. But then in January, we reinvigorated them as drop-in sessions, as surgeries, and they now run every 2 months. And we've been talking through the various policies that have been reviewed and updated. And the next one, which is in January, will be looking at the annual reports. It will be very much like this presentation, looking at what we've been discussing and talking through what the arrangements are, but and also anything that those individuals want to talk through or discuss. Any issues.
Stuart?
Yes.
And could health and safety governors drop into them or not? Or do you want to keep it staff?
I'd like to keep it staff, but I can't see any reason why not. What I'd recommend, I was going to say, speak to your school and make sure that your coordinator's happy for that to happen. Yeah. But I can't see. Can anyone see any potential reason why a school might object to another school's governor being present? I can't see any reason why. Shall I float the idea at the next session?
That would be good.
I will do that. I will carry out a vote. Let's see what happens there. So they're now a regular fixture. And central office. So central office health and safety was the subject of an internal audit. It was my turn. It came around back in 2019. The report was published later. Can't remember now. I have no idea what year it is anymore, let alone when these things happened. And there was quite a bit of work to do around central office to bring it into line with the standards expected in our schools, as outlined in our health and safety policies. Things were in place. It just wasn't at the same level. Simple reason for that is schools were a higher priority. Bums on seats in an office is relatively low risk when you're in a tenanted premises, whereas schools have got lots more moving parts. But it was rightly called to attention that we needed to revisit central office. And so I've got a lot of work to do now around getting that to where it needs to be. But it won't be to the detriment of schools, because those priorities still exist in that way. So we're aware that there are improvements, but schools are always going to be the priority. As I say, things are in place. It's just not as polished as we would like it to be. And that brings on to sort of the objectives review of the year. I won't read through each of those because we'll be here for a long time, but the things that were partially met were the things around audit and moving audit forward. I've really fallen in love with, well, that's probably a bit strong, but visualizers that are used in classrooms, because it's proven to me that things can be carried out remotely, and it's not necessary for me to perhaps spend half a day traveling a day in a school and then half a day traveling back and lose that time when we can connect via Teams. It's difficult for me to reconcile that, because I'm a people person. I like to be in a room with people. I've had to learn to work differently, but I can't, although I desperately want to get out of this room because I feel like I've been stuck in here like a prison cell. I can't argue with the efficiencies that it does deliver. So in-person visits are absolutely necessary and will continue, but we can definitely work smarter as well, is the outcome from that, and that's carried over to next year's. Ionizing radiation sources. I'm radiation protection officer for the group as well. We are working, those of you who may have any knowledge of IR sources, there's a paper form that's provided by CLEAPS that is completed and sent back to me, which I then pass on to CLEAPS. I won't go into the detail of the process. It's all included in the control of radiation at work policy if you want to see it. But to try and improve that, we've built a system very similar to ARMS on the hub for ionizing radiation compliance. So it just removes those bits of paper, and schools can then keep a digital record of their sources and how they're being managed, and update that when it needs to be done, rather than sending a new document in. That's not been launched yet. I'm just putting the finishing touches to it, and I want to run a pilot with a couple of schools that I've got in mind that have got very strong radiation protection supervisors. But then once that's up and running, we'll have to then audit those schools to make sure that they are managing those sources appropriately. The Group Health and Safety Management Policy Committee meeting minutes and e-audits we've covered, and it's about getting those levels up. So please do speak to your schools on making sure that they are where they need to be. And smart log system access across central office is the system that we're currently using for central office training and health and safety compliance. So that relates to the central office objective. And then one of the big areas that's here that's deferred to 21-22 at the end is radon management. That's something that we'd been assured had actually been managed and dealt with before, but once I started picking at it, discovered that we didn't really have the data behind the scenes to show that that was the case. And I carried out a review in it might have been 2019 as well, actually, to work out if this information was held at school level as to whether or not a radon risk assessment had been carried out, particularly for those schools that are in radon affected areas. If you'd like further information on that, what used to be PHE UK HSA have got an entire website dedicated to radon management. But we've got probably half of our schools that are in or bordering radon affected areas, and we don't have the data at the moment as to what the situation is and are there any levels of any significance there. After pulling that information together, we went to tender to a number of firms, and nobody wanted the work. So we're now doing this a little differently. Everything's a little bit delayed because of the pandemic, and also to get the data, you've got to put detectors, actual detector units in the building for a period of 12 weeks. And following discussions with what was PHE at the time, they've advised that the term T1 is the best time to do that because the building has to be in normal use to get reliable data. And also over the last year, normal use was something that didn't really happen a lot. So I'm working with Lincoln Minster School, one of our independents at the moment, to get that radon management data, because we know Lincoln is a radon affected area. Those detectors are due to come out, I think next week. They then get returned to what was PHE. They analyze that data and will send us a report back, and we'll use that information to devise some guidance for schools on how they can get this data themselves. The detectors aren't overly expensive. I think they're £20 each, but the data that they can generate will be very important in determining what happens next, and further information on the UK HSA website on what that actually might be, but further information in due course on that once we have it. And then the annual report always ends, and I'm sorry to those schools and members who are present whose schools' names are on the sheet, but I'll explain why in a moment. So the annual report always ends with the summary of, this is my sort of ready reckoner across the group. So every school and performance in relation to each of the areas that we've discussed in the course of the meeting. So the return of the management policy, health and safety committee meeting minutes, and e-audits, and also a log of service requests. Because if a school has never spoken to me in the year, I won't name any names, then that could give me an indication that maybe communication isn't working, or maybe they're suffering in silence. And it's just one of those extra things that nudges a school further up my priority list. It's not the most sophisticated algorithm, but there is some method to it. It's not just a case of this is where I fancy going this week as opposed to that place. No names mentioned at all to anyone. But one of what we have seen here, from publishing this information in the annual report, is it does change. It is getting better. If we were to go back 3 years, there is a lot more red on this report, and the idea behind it is there's nothing wrong with a little bit of friendly competition. Nobody wants to be that last school with the few red marks on here. Have a look at this when it comes out, and if you're finding that your school has got red next to it, go and have that conversation with your health and safety lead and say, where are we at with our policy, our committees, our re-audits? Is everything up to date? Seek that reassurance from those individuals to make sure we are where we should be. And then just a brief overview of the coming year's objectives. Obviously maintaining policies. We've got a few more up for review, but nowhere near as many. Things like the asbestos policy are due, I think, in the next year. Maintaining arms is a given. Investigating accidents of incidents. I'm trying to close off half a dozen or so live investigations at the moment before I go for Christmas, and so we can get that all of those reports logged as necessary. But there's some really good work going on in schools in relation to investigation of accidents. I would love to run a session on accident investigation. It's on my list. I think we could be better. Some do a really good job, others not so much. But again, I have to go back to my earlier point about criticising heads of department. If no one's ever told them how to do it properly, you can't very well tell them they're doing it wrong. Publish regular briefing notes. That will happen as and when anything of interest comes to light. E-audits will progress. As I say, the work at Height e-audit is out at the moment. Do check that your school has done theirs. Physical audits, ionizing radiation and high-level audits. We've set a target of 20 per year. that's potentially ambitious given events at the moment and just the direction of travel and other things that are going on. But I do want to get back to that. But it's very, it's very important that schools are completing their own checklists and are able to evidence and their own performance. That is really an outcome that we need to stress. Pre-transfer visits for anyone that comes in, obviously, is without a given. We've covered drop-in sessions, COVID support's covered. Policy is fine. That's central office policy there. Continue the development of working relationships with LGB H&S reps. I'd like to continue these sessions. I hope you will do too. Any suggestions on any matters that you'd like to discuss, let me or Leslie know, because otherwise you just have to listen to me talking about whatever I want to talk about for, well, I've kept you over an hour already, but I can keep going, despite the fact my voice sounds like it's about to give up. Radon, obviously, just covered. Ionizing radiation, I've covered, and premises compliance data project is one that I would just like to point on. Is that what I've been trying to do during the course of the pandemic, and this links into the audit program that I mentioned, and schools being aware and being able to evidence their performance, is I want to get better data. I want to be able to be in a position where when one of the members on the call, or a member of the exec, or a trustee, or a regional director, or anyone says, where are we with compliance at such and such a school, or what's the situation in relation to asbestos at X school, I can give them some information, whereas at the moment that's all held at school level. So we're looking to developing EIP, which is, I think, is our Education Information Portal, if I remember the acronym correctly, to be able to hold some of the very high level compliance information. And we're talking about things like fire risk assessment, fire management plan, asbestos survey, electrical installation condition report, those sorts of items where if they're not managed effectively, they cost a lot to put right. They put the building at risk, and they put a large number of people at risk. I don't want to get to a situation where we're micromanaging everything in the schools, and every time you move a table from room 1 to room 2, it has to be logged on some sort of internal system. I don't think that that's sensible or proportionate to what we're trying to achieve. But there are some big items, the ones that I've just mentioned, that put the trust at risk, put the schools at risk, and put the individuals at risk, but also have a habit of coming back to bite us in the future when something goes wrong, and then there's an SCA bid in that goes to estates for something that we should have foreseen. There was a way that we could have detected what was going to happen there. And it will also help with churn, because what's happened a couple of times over the past year is key members of staff, particularly on the facility side of things, have moved on. A new member of staff has come in and said, well, where's all of this information then? And nobody knows. Well, if it's all already held on EIP, then at least they know that those big ticket items are all okay, or they know that there are things that need to be prioritized. That's going to take time to develop. There's a business case going into Finance and Infrastructure Committee in January, and then it will go over to our software development team. And I think they're anticipating 8 to 12 weeks to get that running. So it's definitely sort of a 22, 23 type project. But I wanted to make you aware of it because I think it's a really important step to getting better data and being able to argue compliance in a more comprehensive way. And then that brings me on to the prompts, most of which I've covered in the session already tonight, which is, has your school completed and returned the localized version of the policy? If not, please do so. There are very few now that haven't. So don't be that last one. Don't be that one red on that report next year. Do you have a committee, as Leslie mentioned earlier as well, about when that operates? And there we go. See, non-LGB committee in there. I thought I might have killed it in. Thank you. That meets termly. If not, have that conversation with the head and the health and safety lead or business manager, and get yourself on it. Challenge, support, question, turn the screw. Make sure that the schools are doing what the policies say they should be doing. Any issues, get in touch. And then the sort of thread around competence that I've referred to as well throughout this is, is your head confident that all high-risk departments have competent people in post? Because again, going back to their role as general manager, and if you read any sort of guidance, I was going to get a book off the shelf, but you won't probably be able to see it because of this effect. Like in the AFP handbook, so school sport handbook, it makes clear that the head is responsible for making sure that everyone in their school is competent to do their role. They delegate that responsibility, but they still need to be able to argue that sufficiency. So can you evidence that competence? Has the annual return been completed? That's a useful bit of information that feeds into me each year. And that annual return is something that we launched following a review of the monitoring policy in April of this year, and it came into effect from September. And there are a number of checklists that sit beneath that each school, depending on the phase that it covers, should be completing. So I'll come on to a little bit on that on monitoring, self-assessment and competence, and this is where I wrap up. Is that so? Why have we made the changes to group monitoring? And this is a lot of the points I've already covered this evening. Is that we want to improve intelligence. We need to know more about what's happening in our schools to allow targeted interventions, rather than I fancy going to this place this week or that place next week. So that should we ever be questioned, there's a logic into why we're doing what we're doing. It allows better prioritization of my time. The school self-assessment part is absolutely critical. Schools being able to argue why what they're doing is sufficient. We hope that it will nudge heads of department or whoever else is responsible to push their departments forward if they know that other departments are looking at theirs independently. It can aid LGBs and the health and safety reps members on this call to prioritise area for local support. If you know that, let's not pick on science again, if we know that educational visits, for example, perhaps has not been can't satisfy the checklist that's produced by OEAP, the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel, then there's an opportunity there to look in more detail as to, well, why is that? What's missing? How can we upskill these individuals if that's the issue that's occurring, and come up with a plan that can then be followed through. And it supports that flow of information to the heads. We put a lot of responsibility on them, saying they need to manage their school. They're responsible for everything. They need to know that everyone's competent, but they can only do that if the information is flowing to them. And this is a good way to ensure that happens. And the annual return, ignore the date on 30th of November on there, is supported by these individual department checklists that I mentioned a moment ago that vary depending on each phase. The premises one is one that we've come up with internally. The school sport one is based on the AFP handbook. Excuse me. Educational visits is taken from the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel national guidance, and the science and DT ones are taken from CLEAPS. So other than premises, they're all taken from our nationally recognised bodies, and so we should be doing them. They should be things that are already in place, and they're the yardstick that will be measured against should something go wrong in any of those areas. So they're a really helpful tool to have to making sure that we are where we need to be. And when I come out and do an audit, they're the things that I look at, but there's no reason why schools can't check that themselves. The information is there. It's very clear on what needs to be done, and the supporting information that goes behind each of the points that's covered in those checklists is freely available from those providers. I say with the exception of premises, which is more covered in the premises policies. So by completing those checklists, the school can then complete the annual return, which effectively says, have you completed the premises checklist in the last 12 months? Yes or no? If so, have you devised an action plan to deal with any actions that are arising from that checklist? Yes or no? That checklist is then, there's a space for additional comments, and then signed off by the head and the LGB, and a copy returned to me. And that way I can be satisfied that the school is fully aware of its current risk profile in relation to these areas. It's not 100% compliance, doesn't cover absolutely everything that we do. Things can still slip through the cracks, but these high priority areas are then all being looked at least once a year by the LGB and by the head, and hopefully a sensible plan being derived from them as well. That's the desired outcome then. So you can then use that annual return and the checklist, as I say, that sit within that to inform the improvement plan that can then be reported back to the full LGB, that can be put to the business manager as a request for additional funding should that be necessary, for example in relation to training or competence. I firmly believe that if you have I'm going to pick on science again now, but a science head of department who's never received any training, and their request for funding for training is competing against other educational CPD, there's a chance they're going to lose out. Whereas I'm bound to say this is my area, but that should be getting priority because it relates to compliance and it relates to that school being able to evidence the competence of that individual. I'll then review all the annual returns when they come in, so I can then prioritize, right, who looks like they're doing everything as they should be doing, because I'll take them in good faith. If they're signed off by the head and the LGB and saying, yeah, everything's fine and we've got plans in place and everything's working hunky-dory, I'm not going to question that. There are enough people providing scrutiny of that to make sure that that process is effective and that information is accurate. So do make sure that you are seeing it and that it is being recorded correctly. But there are some that I've already seen that have come through that I think, okay, I need to have a word with you, and I'll set those calls up in the new year to see what's going on, why have we said these sorts of things. And the data will also be included in the annual report. Not necessarily a drill down into what everybody said, but the high level data of who we got responses from and what's the broad picture of yes, no's, are we good or are we not so good. So do take a look at that annual return. It's all contained in the health and safety monitoring policy. There's further guidance in that monitoring policy about proactive monitoring checks. So not waiting for accidents to occur before we go and look at how we organise an event or how we carry out an activity, but actually proactively going out and checking that we're doing what we say we're doing. The example I always give is that there's a rugby match taking place on the field, is go get hold of the risk assessment for rugby or school sport or field sports, however it's been categorized by your school, and look at it. Is it in date, as in was it created sometime in recent history, in line with the review periods defined by the school, but normally no more than 2 years? Has it got somebody's name on it who still works for the school? That's always a good start. Does it refer to relevant guidance such as the AFPI handbook, Safe Practice Handbook, where appropriate? Does it look to broadly cover all areas that you would expect it to see? That's not be a specialist in this area and know absolutely everything that should be here. That is, take a look at it and just, does it look broadly right to you? And that's the desktop exercise. Then go outside and observe the activity. Are we doing in practice what we say we're doing on paper? Back when I used to work in enforcement, that's where organisations fell down 9 times out of 10. Good on paper, poor in practice. So if you can get into the habit of looking at your school's arrangements and what you say you are doing and comparing them to what's actually happening, there's a good chance you'll be able to prevent a lot of adverse events from actually occurring, because that's where custom and practice and habit creep in and mistakes end up getting made. And it's not always a case that somebody's committing a violation and they're deliberately choosing to not follow the procedure. It's just there was perhaps an easier path somewhere along the route and it slipped into that, and that's now become the norm. So do have a look at that policy. It's one of the most important areas of work that we do in health and safety. You can have the best rules in the land and the best guidance and the best processes, but if we don't know that they're actually being used in practice, that's when things go wrong. And that's it from me. Over to Q&A if there's anything else that we'd like to discuss.
So Stuart, thank you so much. I know we've had a few people dropping off because we've gone over, but I didn't want to stop you because it was so relevant, interesting. Casimir makes a really good point around dates on policies and return dates. And I think it's worth thinking about, and we did have this conversation earlier, didn't we? And he said, could I ask that any health and safety checklists developed by UL or schools themselves had a date to be completed or remedied by? Otherwise, they're not a management tool, but a historic record. And that the deadline of 30th of November is your delivery date to trustees and not the deadline for school. Is that right? I thought it was a deadline for the school.
The deadline of 30th of November was a request to schools to return the annual return to me by. I've got a very low return rate of that annual checklist. Now that's probably because this is the first year that's been running, and all of the bits of all the other departmental checklists that I referenced a moment ago, premises, sport, educational visits and the like, sit beneath that, and trying to get all of those completed to feed into the annual report this term with everything else that's been going on has been very challenging. So what I'm actually looking at doing, because I've lost a lot of time here in September in waiting for this, in T1 to wait for this information to come through, and I won't be reviewing it on Christmas Day. I'm considering running it again and instead in T3 of each year, so that I can then crunch that data over the summer holidays, so we can crack on with it, supporting schools as soon as you come back in September. But it's been a bit of a trial and error there, and perhaps if I'd maybe I would have been able to foresee that would have been a better time to run it. But absolutely is that deadline is not correct and will be revised.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I hadn't appreciated that this was the first year that it had been introduced. So I was making certain assumptions about it, that it was long-standing and has been since the ARC and so on and so forth.
No, sadly not. But it's got potential to be a really useful tool at all levels, but it needs to be used correctly, and it needs to have some clear outcomes from it. So you're absolutely right. I think if I was to say to a school that hasn't returned the annual return yet, focus on the departmental checklists. Don't worry about the annual return, because that will allow you then to devise the action plans that may be necessary in each of those departments, so that when we then get to T3 and I say, oh, sorry, can you all please complete this annual return again? You're only doing it once. It should then have a much better, much more complete picture as to how things are in the school. But, and I say this again, is if you've got any questions, if anyone has any questions when they're completing it, just get in touch. Don't suffer in silence. Let me know what's going on. There is a section in that annual return where there's a point to comment on any significant incidents that occurred. So if a school had a serious accident that they'd investigated and come up with some actions, there's an opportunity to reference that. You don't have to put the whole thing in again, but you can explain what happened, lessons learned, and improvements that have been made. But there's also a section for any additional comments. There's a real opportunity to sort of sell why the school feels like it's doing well, or perhaps not, perhaps why there are issues and what those concerns are. It's an opportunity to flag them.
Thanks, Stuart. I've only had one question via email, which is a request around basic training for health and safety governors. Now, if you recall, we did do that right at the start. It seems a heck of a long time ago now, but it's one of the first things that you did. And maybe we should be revisiting it after Christmas at some point, spring term, summer term, maybe, because we've got some new governors that have just taken up this role, and I know that would be appreciated. Sam's just said that they would appreciate that. So, yeah.
Okay.
I think that might be something we need to.
Is that what we did way back in March?
Yeah, we did.
Is that what that was? I can't remember. I remember we weren't allowed outside, and my birthday's in March.
You overran, Stuart. Can I just say that?
Say again?
It was another one you overran. Just.
Well.
There.
I unfortunately, it's a big topic and there's a lot I could talk about.
So I think that's a lesson for us all.
When you said a couple of people had dropped off, I couldn't see because my screen was still taken up with the presentation, and I thought I was going to come out of that and it'd be just me and you, Leslie. Talking to an empty room, everyone's going to watch the recording. But
can I just say a huge thank you though, Stuart, because I found it really useful. Every time I listen to you talking, there's hundreds of things I write down thinking, oh, golly, I didn't know that. And I've been doing this a long time, so thank you ever so much. And we all know where you are, and I will field questions to you. The other thing is, if you can send me your PowerPoint, I'll make sure that goes up.
Yeah, I can do that. What I'll just say on the training side of things, yeah, happy to do another session on that. But if anyone's looking for something in the meantime, IOSH Managing Safely is a good place to start. If you have a word with your school, that's the IOSH Managing Safely qualification. See, I'm going to keep talking now. IOSH Managing Safely is a requirement for our health and safety coordinators and deputy coordinators. It used to be a taught course only, and I used to deliver it, but it was a minimum of 24 hours contact time, and we used to do it 2 days a week over 2 weeks. But it's not recently now, it's probably 3 years. It's been available as an online course that you can dip in and out of, and that might be something that's worth looking at for those individuals that want to expand their health and safety knowledge. The reason I mentioned about it being a requirement for our coordinators is a lot of them will already be buying it from an online provider. There's no requirement to use any specific provider as long as it's IOSH accredited. So have a word with your health and safety leads, see who they've used, and get hold of it. It's about £120. So it's not expensive. It's and it's a good introduction to health and safety, definitely.
It should be you for that, by the way, as governor. It should be school and it'd be passed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, just in case that wasn't clear. Don't put hands in your pocket for this. You know, this should be paid for. And I've just seen that there's a Cambridge United top in the room.
That's a bit off message.
Yeah, that is true. It is a Cambridge United top.
Well done, good man. Right, I'm going to close the recording now, just so that you can say whatever you need to say. Thank you ever so much.